There's a mountain that has never had a single footprint on it. Not one. Ever. And it isn't because no one could reach the top. Some of the most skilled climbers alive have had the training, the gear, and even official permission, and turned around anyway. A government that rarely backs down to anyone reversed a decision just to keep people off this one peak. Explorers from an empire that mapped almost the entire region left it alone, decade after decade, on purpose. 4 major religions, followed by over 1 billion people combined, all point to this exact same spot and call it sacred. So what is actually sitting at the top of this mountain? And why does almost no one who gets close enough ever try to find out? Picture a mountain that has beaten every serious climber on Earth without a single one of them ever stepping foot on it. That's not because they lost, it's because they never even tried. Somewhere in the far west of Tibet, past the point where roads give out and rivers seem to start out of nowhere, a dark, almost perfectly shaped peak rises out of the ground. It isn't the tallest mountain on the planet. It isn't even in the top 100. Other peaks nearby are taller and far more dangerous to climb. But out of every mountain on Earth, this is the one no human has ever stood on top of. Its name is Mount Kailash. Here's the part. Most people never hear. Kailash isn't avoided, it's protected. Those are 2 very different things, and once you understand the difference, the whole story starts to look different too. Start with something that sounds made up until you check it. In the 1980s, China offered a rare climbing permit for Kailash to Reinhold Messner, widely considered the greatest high-altitude climber who has ever lived. He was the first person to summit all 14 of the world's 8,000-meter peaks, and he did it without bottled oxygen. No government had ever handed out a permit for this mountain before. He said, "No, sit with that for a second." The single most accomplished climber in modern history was offered the chance to be first on a mountain nobody had ever conquered. And he walked away from it. He wasn't alone. According to accounts of the period, Sir Edmund Hillary, the first man to ever summit Everest, also turned down the chance to attempt Kailash. 2 of the greatest climbers who ever lived. 2 men who had already done what the world once called impossible. Both looked at this one mountain and chose to leave it standing. What does that tell you? These weren't men afraid of altitude. They weren't afraid of cold or wind or rock. They'd already beaten mountains twice as brutal as this one, so why walk away from Kailash specifically? Monks who live at the base of the mountain, and who have spent generations walking around it instead of climbing it, describe the reason differently than you'd expect. To them, it was never really about the physical danger. It was about what they believe waits at the top. To understand that belief, you need to understand what this mountain actually represents. It isn't sacred to just one group. It's the spiritual center of 4 entirely separate religions, each with hundreds of millions of followers, all pointing to the same patch of frozen rock in one of the emptiest places on the planet. To Hindus, Kailash is the literal home of the god Shiva, not a symbol, not a metaphor. Believers hold that a god is physically present there, right now, today. To Tibetan Buddhists, the mountain is identified with Mount Meru, the axis around which the entire universe is organized, according to their cosmology. Not a representation of the center of everything, the actual center, as far as the tradition is concerned. To followers of Jainism, this is the place where their very first spiritual teacher broke free from the cycle of death and rebirth forever. And to followers of Bon, a religion older than Buddhism in Tibet, Kailash is described as the pillar that connects heaven and earth, the exact point where prayers rise up and blessings come back down. 4 separate belief systems, 4 separate cultures, developing independently, centuries apart. And every single one landed on the same mountain. That's not something anyone has been able to fully explain away as coincidence. It gets bigger from there. Tradition holds that 4 of the most important rivers in Asia begin from springs near the base of Kailash, rivers that today provide water to hundreds of millions of people. In the old stories, they flow outward from the mountain in 4 directions, as though the peak itself were the starting point of life for an entire continent. Think about the size of that claim. This isn't folklore about a small village. Well, this is a belief that the water feeding a huge share of humanity traces back to one unclimbed peak. Whether the geography lines up perfectly or not, the fact that so many separate cultures place the literal source of life at this one spot tells you exactly how central this mountain has always been to the people living around it. And it wasn't only pilgrims who left the mountain alone. During the British colonial period, surveyors were sent out to map nearly every peak across the Himalayas. They had the manpower, the funding, and the technical skill to attempt Kailash. According to the historical record, they never did. Not because of weather, not because of money. They simply chose not to try, expedition after expedition, decade after decade. An empire that mapped most of the region left this one mountain conspicuously alone. There's an old story, still told by monks in the region, about a contest that supposedly took place near the base of the mountain long ago. not a battle of weapons, but of what the tradition calls spiritual power, between a Buddhist master and a priest of the older Bon faiths, each trying to claim the mountain for their side. According to the legend, the outcome of that contest is why Kailash carries the weight it does today. This is passed down as legend, not documented history, but the fact that it's been retold for centuries says something about how seriously this place has always been treated. In 2001, a Spanish climbing team formally requested permission to attempt Kailash. This wasn't a rogue group sneaking past a checkpoint. It was an official request, filed through the proper channels, from a team with the skill to actually pull it off. The reaction was immediate and enormous. Religious leaders across several countries spoke out against it. Environmental groups joined in. Hindu, Buddhist, Jain, and Bon communities around the world voiced anger that any team might be the first to reach their most sacred site. The reaction was immediate and enormous. Religious leaders across several countries spoke out against it. That ban still stands today, more than 20 years later. It has never been lifted for anyone under any circumstances. Here's the part that matters. This isn't just a government being careful. This is a state that rarely bends to outside pressure, making an exception for exactly one mountain. Out of every peak inside its borders, this is the single line it won't let anyone cross. Now you have two separate confirmations, stacked on top of each other. The greatest climbers in history chose not to attempt it, and a national government made attempting it permanently illegal. That's not random caution. That's coordinated, sustained protection, spanning governments, generations, and belief systems that otherwise share almost nothing. And once you start looking for that pattern, you find it again and again. In the decades after the first British survey, several private expeditions from different countries quietly applied for permission to climb Kailash, hoping the earlier refusals were just circumstance. Every single request was either denied outright or simply disappeared into silence, never approved, never explained. No government has ever released a detailed public reason for why this one mountain, out of every peak inside its territory, receives this level of protection. Mystery. When a government explains a restriction, it becomes policy. When it never explains, the restriction starts to feel like something everyone already understands without needing to say it out loud. But the story goes further than religion or diplomacy. Researchers who study the region point out that Kailash sits inside one of the least scientifically documented mountain zones on Earth, not because it's physically hard to reach, but because access is restricted at the government level. That blocks more than climbers. It blocks geological survey teams, too. Think about that. Satellites can map the ocean floor, drones can survey jungle canopies nobody has ever walked through. Scientists have modeled the surface of Mars in incredible detail, and there's a mountain on Earth that remains almost entirely unstudied. Not for lack of technology, but because no one is allowed to get close enough to study it properly. Compare that to how the rest of the world's great peaks have been treated. Everest has been mapped down to the meter, its ice measured, its weather modeled precisely enough that guide companies can forecast summit conditions days ahead. K2, even more remote and more dangerous, has still been extensively studied by geologists. Even Denali, tucked deep in Alaska, has decades of glacier research behind it. Kailash, sitting at a comparatively modest height and technically reachable by modern standards, remains one of the only major peaks left where this kind of basic scientific study simply hasn't happened. Not because it can't be done, because it hasn't been allowed. This is where the monks' version of the story becomes hard to dismiss outright. For generations, monks living near Kailash have described the mountains almost unnaturally in shape. Four sides, sharp symmetry, striations running across its face in strikingly regular lines. To many who've observed it for centuries, that isn't just an interesting quirk of weather and erosion. Some hold it as evidence that the mountain wasn't meant to be an ordinary geological formation at all, that its shape lines up deliberately with what they describe as a deeper order to the universe. Here's the honest, responsible answer, though. No peer-reviewed geological study has ever confirmed that Kailash's shape is anything other than the natural, if unusually striking, result of wind, ice, and layered rock. Mainstream geology treats the symmetry as rare but explainable. That's the evidence-based position, and it's worth saying plainly. But here's what keeps the question open. You can't run a full modern survey on a mountain you're not allowed to survey. The same restriction that keeps climbers off Kailash is the exact restriction that has kept it out of reach of the kind of detailed scientific study that's already been done on nearly every comparable peak on the planet. So for now, this doesn't get settled with data. It survives on legend, distant observation, and centuries of testimony that's never been formally tested. The testimony goes deeper than most outsiders ever hear, because very little of it has been translated or published for a Western audience. According to accounts passed down through generations of practitioners, monks who spent years in meditation near the base describe strange sensations the closer they get to the slopes, disorientation, a warped sense of time, a kind of mental pressure. Some traditions linked to spiritual energy they believe radiates from the summit. Skeptics have a fair counterpoint here. Low oxygen at high altitude is a well-documented cause of disorientation and altered perception. No controlled study has ever separated any spiritual force from the simple fact that the base of this mountain already sits above 4,000 meters, where the brain doesn't run quite the way it does at sea level. That caveat matters, and it should be said clearly. But here's the detail that keeps researchers coming back to the story instead of closing the file. These accounts, across centuries, from monks who never met each other and had no way to compare notes, describe strikingly similar sensations. Different eras, different monasteries, similar language again and again. Altitude alone doesn't fully explain why that pattern would hold up across such a long, disconnected timeline. Here's where legend turns into something with real, present-day stakes. According to analysts who study the region, if a foreign climber, especially someone from India or a Western country, attempted an unauthorized descent of Kailash today, it likely would be treated as a simple trespassing case. The mountain sits close to one of the most sensitive, closely watched borders on Earth, the disputed frontier between China and India. Some who study this border believe an unauthorized climb could realistically escalate into a serious diplomatic standoff between two nuclear-armed nations. That's it for a second. This isn't a movie plot. It's the actual assessment of people whose job is studying that exact border. A single unauthorized step near the summit of a mountain most people have never heard of could, under the wrong conditions, spark real tension between two of the most powerful, heavily populated countries on the planet. That is not the profile of an ordinary mountain. That's the profile of a flashpoint, hiding behind a story about gods and monks and pilgrimage. Because the spiritual framing keeps things calm. It keeps millions of pilgrims walking peacefully around the base every year, instead of expedition teams testing the slopes and testing the patience of two governments that already eye each other warily across that line. Here's the part almost no one connects. The religious ban and the political ban aren't two separate stories running side by side. They're the same wall built out of two different materials. Faith gives the mountain its untouchable status among the people who live near it. Law gives that same status real and forceful weight on the international stage. Remove either one, and the whole structure gets shaky. For the mountain, for the border, and for the uneasy peace surrounding one of the most tense stretches of contested territory on Earth. So if the monks don't climb it, what do they do instead? They walk around it. For thousands of years, pilgrims from all four traditions have made what's called the Kailash Kora, a walk around the base, rather, than a climb to the top. This isn't a casual stroll. Depending on the route, it can take several days, crossing terrain above 5,000 meters through thin air and brutal cold. Some devoted pilgrims complete the entire circuit through full-body prostrations, lying down, standing back up, stepping forward, and lying down again over and over for the whole distance. Why do that, instead of simply climbing to the top? Because in the belief systems built around this mountain, the summit was never the point. The goal was closeness, devotion, change from the inside out. The full circuit crosses a pass above 5,600 meters, higher than plenty of famous mountain summits reached by professional expeditions. And pilgrims aren't doing this with oxygen tanks, professional guides, or rescue teams standing by. Many walk in ordinary clothing, carrying only what they can manage, relying on faith and the belief that the hardship itself is part of what makes the journey meaningful. Every year, some of them don't survive the crossing. The mountain doesn't need to be climbed to take a life. Just walking around its base, at that altitude and that weather, already carries real risk. And people accept that risk willingly, year after year, because to them the reward isn't a photo from the summit. It's something inside them changing, something no photo could ever capture. Compare that to Everest. In the decades since Hillary's first descent, Everest has turned into something closer to a business than a sacred pursuit. Fixed ropes, base camps, lines of climbers queuing near the summit on clear days, sometimes waiting at nearly 9,000 meters just for their turn at a photo. Everest was conquered, and in being conquered, it changed from sacred ground into an achievement you can buy a permit for. Kailash was never allowed to go through that. And according to people who study the region, that might be exactly the point. By staying unclimbed, unsurveyed, and largely untouched, this mountain holds on to something almost nothing else of its size and fame still has. Real, unresolved mystery, protected at once by faith, by law, and by a fragile political balance nobody wants to disturb. Here's the part that should genuinely give you pause. None of this protection is guaranteed to last. The world around Kailash is changing fast. New roads are being carved into terrain that used to be unreachable. Tourism access is expanding. Governments are showing growing interest in developing remote border regions for both economic and strategic reasons. The isolation that has kept Kailash untouched for centuries isn't some unbreakable law of nature. It's a policy, and policies can change. Consider something that happened not far away, in a separate but eerily similar case buried and declassified in American records. In 1965, the same decade Messner and Hillary would later turn down Kailash, a covert mission in these same mountains went badly wrong. A piece of sensitive equipment was lost high on another sacred peak in terrain remote enough and politically sensitive enough that it has reportedly never been recovered even decades later. The story stayed buried for years, only surfacing through later investigative reporting, and even now officials on more than one side of it don't fully agree on what should happen next. It's worth sitting with that parallel. The same mountain range, hiding ancient religious mystery at Kailash, has also separately hidden modern secrets of its own. This entire region has a long, documented habit of guarding things it doesn't want the outside world looking at too closely, sacred or classified, spiritual or strategic. The pattern repeats across decades. Remote Himalayan terrain keeps turning out to be the perfect place to keep something hidden. Zoom out even further, and the pattern gets harder to write off as coincidence. Across the wider Himalayan and Tibetan Plateau region, there's a recurring theme. Restricted zones that sit exactly where spiritual importance overlaps with strategic military value. The border areas across this whole stretch of Asia are some of the most closely watched, least accessible places on the planet, not mainly because of the terrain, but because of what sits on either side of the line. Kailash happens to sit almost exactly on that fault line, close enough to the disputed frontier that protecting it serves two purposes at once, in a way that feels almost too convenient to be accidental. A sacred mountain nobody can climb is also, quietly, a sacred mountain. Nobody can survey, photograph in detail, or use to watch activity on either side of one of the most contested borders in the world. Faith and secrecy end up reinforcing each other so completely that it's genuinely hard to say where one stops and the other begins. So when monks talk quietly about forces protecting the summit, forces beyond ordinary explanation, maybe they aren't speaking in pure metaphor. Maybe, in the only language their tradition gives them, they're describing the same instinct that has independently led climbers, governments, and entire nations to the same conclusion, for very different reasons. Some places are safer left unexplored. Here's what most people miss. Kailash sits at the exact meeting point of three forces that almost never overlap in the same location. Deep religious devotion, hard enforceable modern law, and quiet, high-stakes international politics. Most sacred sites on Earth have one of those forces protecting them. A few have two. Kailash may be the only place on the planet where all three line up this strongly, reinforcing each other so completely that even the most fearless, record-breaking climbers in history looked at it and chose to walk away. And that raises a question nobody has fully answered. If the physical challenge were the only obstacle, someone would have solved it by now. Humans have climbed taller mountains, colder mountains, far more technically brutal mountains, in far more remote corners of the world. Kailash, at just over 6,000 meters, isn't even close to the hardest technical climb on Earth by any normal measure. So the mountain isn't unclimbed because it can't be climbed. It's unclimbed because generation after generation, culture after culture, government after government, the people who could have been first chose not to be. What does that tell you about what they believe is actually up there? The monks who circle the base every year aren't waiting for someone to finally reach the top and settle the question for good. In their tradition, this was never meant to be settled by conquest. It was meant to be approached with humility, one slow step at a time around the base for as long as the mountain allows it. But the world outside that circle of devotion isn't standing still. Borders shift, governments change their minds. Roads creep closer every year, and somewhere in the gap between ancient legend and modern satellite imagery, a 6,000-meter mystery just keeps sitting exactly where it's always sat, watched by monks, guarded by law, and monitored by two nuclear powers who both understand exactly how sensitive this ground really is. The real question here was never whether Kailash could eventually be climbed. Time and technology tend to solve almost everything eventually. The real question is what happens the moment someone finally reaches that summit. Whether we finally understand what's actually up there, or whether the very thing that made this mountain the most mysterious place on Earth disappears the second the mystery gets solved. And so far, nobody, not the monks, not the mountaineers, not the governments guarding the border beneath it, seems willing to be the one who finds out. Think about everyone who's already stood at the base and turned back, not from lack of skill, not from lack of money, gear, or conditioning. Messner had already proven he could survive terrain that killed far more experienced climbers than him. Hillary had already done what an entire century of mountaineers called impossible before him. Colonial surveyors, backed by the resources of an empire, had every tool needed to chart this peak and still left it alone. Modern expedition teams, with satellite weather forecasting and decades of high-altitude medical knowledge, have looked at a modest 6,000-meter mountain and still walked away. At some point, that much refusal stops looking like a string of separate decisions. It starts looking like a signal, as if everyone who gets close enough to seriously consider it arrives at the same unspoken conclusion. Whether they explain it through religion, caution, or a gut feeling they can't quite put into words, the monks who spend their lives circling this mountain would probably tell you there's nothing mysterious about it at all. To them, the answer has stayed the same for centuries. Some places were never meant to be summits. Some places were only ever meant to be approached, circled, and respected from a careful distance, not because we lacked the strength to reach them, but because reaching them was never really the point. Whether you take that as literal spiritual truth, as one of history's most effective conservation strategies, or as the most convenient possible cover for a quiet arrangement between two nations that would rather not draw attention to a sensitive border, the outcome on the ground stays exactly the same. The mountain stands untouched, the summit remains unmarked, and every year a fresh line of pilgrims arrives at its base, ready to take the long way around, leaving the one question that actually matters sitting exactly where it's always sat, unanswered, at the top of a black stone pyramid that the whole world, for reasons it still can't fully agree on, has chosen to leave alone. If a mountain can hold three of the most powerful forces on Earth in balance for this long just by staying unknown, it makes you wonder how many other unanswered questions out there are only still unanswered because someone, somewhere, decided that it was safer for everyone. If this kind of mystery is the one that gets under your skin, stick around. There are more places on this planet still guarding secrets in plain sight, and we're going looking for the next one.